In the past couple of months, we've seen unprecedented levels of coverage for county councils in the media, which is fantastic for us, highlighting the financial challenges we face and the impact that this will have on our residents, and quite a lot also, as we all know, on adult social care. And I was just saying that I think we need the same amount of coverage on children's social care as well into the future. Heading towards the speakers today have featured our work a lot, and I thank them for that. At a time when Brexit seems to completely consume Westminster and the media, it's really nice to have some journalists in the national press who are interested in what we're interested in, which is services for our residents, important services. And we're asking them today if they can provide us further advice on what aspects of our stories that are of interest to them, how we can make an impact with those working with the journalisms, but also by using some of our counties, I would suggest, to work with you. And to make sure that both the media perceives and interacts with us as a sector. But more than that, to make sure that through them, we can make sure that the public really understands the role of the local councils and how we are impacted, particularly at the moment by our financial position, but also by the demography that we are dealing with. Heading now towards the spending review and our campaigning to influence the way that government allocates funding, we need to develop and understand towards how much we break through that Westminster bubble at the moment of Brexit, and how we can stop that dominating our news and make sure that our voices are heard on behalf of our residents and our services. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased today to welcome Patrick Butler, who is the social policy editor of The Guardian, Alison Holt, who is the BBC social affairs correspondent, and she's the one, I believe, that writes all the stories that we're interested in on the news, particularly at 6 and at 10. And lastly, then we've got Andy Bounds, who is the Northern correspondent, but also the enterprise editor for the Financial Times. So I welcome all three of them. And Patrick, if you would like to start. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm the social policy editor at The Guardian. I've been there about 18 years now, and I mainly write news now. I used to edit the society pages, our old public service jobs section. The Guardian now, as you probably realise, is a global news organisation. It's read by people all over the world, and we have 1 million paying subscribers and members. We do have a UK paper too. There's always a tension, or is more of a tension, a lot more of a tension these days, a tension between the global readership, if you like, and local readership. The day-to-day business of what councils do was probably outside of the Wednesday Society pages in recent years, not really something that we covered very much. That, I would say, has started to change, as you've probably noticed, in the past 18 months. Local authorities have become this year front page news, and this is largely because of cuts and austerity. So you are on the front line of a story. I would say what changed is that until recently, generally speaking, local government was a story without much drama in it. It may have been quite dramatic for you, but from terms of the national media perspective, there's very little drama. So we had quite a few years of cuts with only sporadic coverage, I would have said. Going back to 2011-12, I think we reported the shock of the cuts for the first time. and everyone took a deep breath, and this was a new story for the media. Then, by and large, we lost interest for 2 or 3 years. The wheels didn't appear to be falling off. It was a period of relative calm. We had dire warnings from some of the northern metropolitan councils, but by and large, there was stability. And then Northamptonshire happened. And I think that's what changed this year, really. I think we had to understand what Section 114 meant, but as soon as the media understood what a Section 114 notice was, we got it. And we knew that it meant that you were bust, or rather Northamptonshire was bust. So it defined the story, it brought drama to the story. It made cuts real, so this wasn't whinging. There may have been some whinging, but essentially this was not shroud waving. It was a council that, in as far as a council could be, it was bankrupt. There was an interesting political story too, a tale of mismanagement. This also, irony of ironies, was a Conservative-run council brought down by, amongst other things, Tory policy of austerity. And there was a human angle. There were recriminations, political recriminations at the top of the council and amongst the county's Tory MPs. And yes, your voters and your residents, or Northamptonshire's residents, were getting quite alarmed too. So this became a great story. Northamptonshire will run and run. Last week, the Commissioner was sent in to oversee its collapsed children's services. And I have to say, there is something sort of appallingly compelling about Northamptonshire's predicament. And I don't say that with any ill will towards the council. And this is a terrible thing for the county. But there's a kind of morbid anticipation behind this story. Can Northamptonshire break even? And if it can, what is going to be the human cost of that and the cost to services? And this is an ongoing saga, and there are subplots in Somerset, Lancashire, and elsewhere. From the Guardian's point of view, given that there's a lot of interest now from my editor and news editor in local government stories, what will the Guardian be interested in? Well, first of all, it's the money. We follow the money, or the lack of it, how it will be distributed and shared out. The sharing of the cuts and the resources in local government between north and south, between deprived areas and leafy areas, is a story we have followed and will be following more closely. We are very interested as a news organisation in stories about equity and fairness. We will be watching the Fair Funding Review closely and the Social Care Green Paper. And as much as we are interested in the quantum of money, which may or may not be coming your way, we'll also be interested in how it's shared out. Another area we are interested in is understanding the impact of cuts. And I think media can always understand cuts in simple terms. So if you close a library, we will notice and we will clock it. If you close a Sure Start Centre, we get that. But what about those modest lines in the draft budget? And I'm actually one of those geeky people that reads through some of your draft budgets line by line, that don't attract any attention. So the removal of the bus subsidy on a rural route, for example. What is the human cost there? How is that going to change people's lives? That's a story we are very interested in. I think, in a way, we've got past the point of saying, 30 Sure Start centres are going to close. I think we're interested now in the real kind of human picture, the picture of how these cuts are impacting on the fabric of our communities. What does it mean, for example, when a council suggests, as East Sussex did recently, that family and neighbours will have to begin to take on a bigger role in caring for elderly relatives? Now, that is a really interesting shift and something we don't talk about. What does that mean? What does it mean if you are someone who is reliant a few days a week on someone coming in to wash you and clean you and dress you, and suddenly you lose a day or two of that? That's the kind of detail that I think we are going to start to look at in more and more. So how do you make hidden cuts visible is one of our challenges. Of course, you may be wanting to move in the opposite direction, but that's certainly something we will want to do. We're also interested in who is impacted by the cuts. I would expect the media to focus a lot on homelessness this winter, and that may not be your direct responsibility. For those of you in this room, especially as winter comes on. And I think what's interesting is that we often use the word destitution these days. Now, even 3 years ago, we never talked about destitution except in the context of asylum seekers, and now it's a word that we use quite commonly to talk about people who can't guarantee that they are going to be able to eat that day or have a roof over their head. And that's something we're beginning to take notice of. Councils, we know, are helping pick up the pieces of welfare reform, and as we know that is something that, again, the multiple impacts of spending cuts in councils and welfare reform is something that we're beginning to piece together and look at. But it's not just the poorest off in society. I think an emerging interest for The Guardian and probably other national media is the way cuts hit the relatively well off. And one of the most striking elements for me of the austerity saga is the way the waterline of cuts has crept up the class and income scale. And you see this already, you will have seen this when you try and close a library. And I think that you're going to see more and more of that. And I think that we in the media are going to, because our readers are going to talk about it a lot more too. So I think we will see more and more of that when things like parks and community centres close or have restricted opening, bus subsidies go, charging is introduced, especially for things like recycling. So cuts hitting the middle classes will be an interesting story for us. In terms of the big picture, three questions I think we'll be trying to answer over the next few months. With councils generally, why, as residents, are we paying more in council tax for fewer services of lower quality? How do you square that circle? Just as the NHS is dominating national public spending to the point where we're starting to pay for very little else, are we happy that councils will soon be funding social care, adults and children, and very little else? Is that sustainable? Is that equitable? We're interested in that. If you set a balanced budget next year, does that mean you are a well-run council or a cold-bloodedly ruthless one? And what does a core offer mean for residents and voters, especially vulnerable ones? Core offer is a wonderful phrase, isn't it? It still makes you sound like you're getting something. It's an offer. And I think we will be examining the language around things like core offer and looking at what does this really mean? At what point do cuts start to trigger legal challenges? At what point do cuts start to trigger some kind of public unrest, if nothing else, at the voting booths? So that's just a flavour of what we're interested in, some of the challenges that, of course, you know all about and we in the media are beginning to discover. I'll finish up by saying that we are very keen to tell the stories and to really to understand the complexity of these stories and how it's coming about and the work that you're doing and the very real choices and difficult choices that you have to make. And I would be very interested if anyone would like me to talk to me about how they would be interested in working with us to report the saga of the cuts from the council's perspective. Just contact me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you for that. We will have hopefully time for questions at the end. Alison.
Okay, well, let me start by explaining a little bit about my role as social affairs correspondent for BBC News. I mainly work in news, which is for the 6 and 10 o'clock news, so the most watched TV bulletins in the country at the moment. Things are shifting more towards online, so that's a constantly changing landscape. I also work for Panorama, and they tend to be longer investigations or stories that get under the skin of an issue. If I look back at what I've spent most of the last certainly the last couple of months, but it's been increasing over the last couple of years. It has been stories on adult social care and increasingly on children's services. I mean, last week it was covering allied healthcare and its demise. I think that was a particularly interesting one in the context of this talk about challenging the Westminster bubble. You have a major provider of home care in the country handing its contracts over, and at the same time we've got everything going on around Brexit, and I think it got a read on the 6 o'clock news that night. It wasn't that people didn't realise that it was important, it was more that in that intense political debate, there wasn't the space within the programmes to look at the issue, which I personally think raises questions about how we have a sensible debate about issues such as that. Not that long ago, I would really have struggled to get something about council cuts and so on onto the main news bulletins. But with the exception of when everything's kicking off in terms of Brexit, it has been much easier in the last, increasingly in the last year, to get airtime on the main national news bulletins, to the point of earlier this year, the editor of the 6 and 10 asking me to do a special series looking at pressures in terms of adult social care. So people are listening, people are interested, but there is a wider question about how much they really understand in terms, within newsrooms, but more widely in terms of the general public, about what services councils provide. So I think it would shock many people, if not most people, that some councils, it's nearly half their budget going on adult social care. Most people will think in terms of councils about what they know about them. So, the potholes, the gritting of the roads, the bins being collected, perhaps the libraries. It's much less that adult social care, children's services are largely invisible to people until they need them. And I think that is a really tricky issue in terms of getting a sensible debate about all of these issues. I don't know how many of you will have seen the recent Local Government Association survey on adult social care, but I thought there were some really interesting findings in there. Not least that I think it was 48% of people that they surveyed didn't know what the term adult social care meant, which I think is really, well, I was going to say shocking, but actually I don't think it is that shocking. I don't think it's that surprising, but I think it is deeply saddening considering we have an ageing population. And actually these are issues we all need to engage with. 85% of people had made no plans in terms of future care costs. 50% have never even had a thought about planning for future care costs. I think for me, when I looked at those stats, that really underlined the scale of the task for getting a sensible debate about how we fund adult social care in the future. There was another thing that struck me, was at about the time of the Dilnot report, so I think that was 2011-12, that sort of time, there was a similar survey done. And actually, understanding and perceptions of adult social care had not changed that much in that time. So whatever we are collectively doing, we're not really doing enough to help people understand issues which will affect them in future life. So I think that gives us all, raises questions for us all about how do you get a truly informed debate about, yes, future of councils, but more importantly, the future of people, those people who need services like adult social care or children's services. And I think that is, we need to knock on your doors more often. I think councils need to be more open to telling those stories. And there are some really notable exceptions of those who are absolutely stepping up and doing that. but there are a lot of people who aren't, or a lot of authorities who aren't. I did a piece for about 2-3 weeks ago about children's services, looking at spending pressures on children's services, which I think for most, if not all of you, is the huge new driver that is coming down the road. And we actually started about a year ago, and trying to find a local authority that would allow us to tell some of that story. And we were due to start filming on the Monday with one, and on the Friday they pulled out. And we had a similar attempt a few months later, and to be honest, we stopped for a while. Then back in October, we blitzed, rang lots of authorities. Well, I think we rang about a dozen. A lot didn't get back to us. They wouldn't even have the conversation. I had one interesting conversation with a press officer who, when I explained we were trying to look at the pressures on children's services, said, "Oh, well, we won't be doing that." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, we don't do that sort of thing. We don't talk about these issues." I said, "Well, would you mind having those conversations and seeing if things might be different now?" And the reaction was, "Well, I'll do that, but I don't think it'll be any different." And it wasn't. Liverpool let us in, and it was a really powerful piece, and it led the 6 o'clock news bulletin. So you've got, one of the most watched news bulletins leading its programme with an issue which is really important. And in my terms, as a journalist, that's how you get a debate started. You start people talking. But also from a television point of view, I need to see it. I can't just have people telling me about the problem. I need to see the problem. So if you want debates on issues around funding to move forward, I think at your end of things, you need to think very carefully about how do you show people. And for me, that is a really important part of having an open, democratic debate. There are always issues around confidentiality. There are always issues of sensitivity. They can be negotiated. They can be found ways around. We have responsibilities to people. We have to be careful and respect confidentiality. It's not a one-sided thing. So if you want to break through that Westminster bubble, I think you need to think about how you do that. And in terms of the future, well, the big debate which is coming up, or the big question, is what will happen in terms of the future funding of adult social care. I wish I could tell you I had an absolute inside track on what was happening, but I don't. And all the indications that I've certainly heard are that it will be very green, and it'll be a list of options, which then, that could change. It seems to change frequently. But that then raises other questions for you, I would say, about there's unlikely to be a quick solution to future funding of adult social care. So how do you fill that gap in terms of meeting that increasing demand? So,
thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, Alison. Some questions there, I think. Yes, and lastly, Andy.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. Falling revenues, rising demand on services, staff cuts, technological change, transforming customer expectations. That's enough about the problems of the media. Let's talk about councils. What I'm trying to illustrate with that is actually that we are under as much pressure as you are in our newsrooms, and time poor, information overloaded, and therefore anyone that can cut through that with an interesting story, illustrated in the way Alison suggested with real people, is going to have some success. I take their point, both the earlier speakers, that a lot of the problems that are talked about are invisible to the general public. I mean, the Financial Times is obviously a global organisation, like The Guardian and the BBC now are. We're never going to run, daily stories about the council funding or anything. I mean, we might run one every couple of weeks, something like that, on various issues, which touch on local government, devolution, that sort of thing. But we tend to do them in depth. The big question that that I've had, since Northampton is, well, who's the next Northampton? So if anyone wants to put their hand up, Northamptonshire, sorry, we'll come and talk to you. But, and I think Northamptonshire, which did open blow the lid off this sort of long debate about when are the cuts actually going to, put somebody down, is still a complicated story. Because the news desk says, well, why did what happened to Northampton only happen to Northamptonshire? And you say, well, they had these big cuts. Well, hasn't everyone had these big cuts? Well, they had, didn't raise the council tax enough. Well, haven't other people done that? Yeah, but the funding formula is a bit unfair. Well, isn't that the same for other people? Oh, well, it was badly managed as well. And you sort of come through this tick box list of about 10 different things. So it's very hard to even put your finger on what sent Northampton down. And what's, every story is unique. And that's the challenge we've got, is to tell the next unique story, I guess. And equally, just as things hit crisis point, the government does seem to have a habit of finding some money down the back of the sofa and keeping everybody going for a few more months. But as, Paul Carter said to me yesterday, these are sort of short-term lifelines that keep getting bunged out, and it sort of staves off the day. But we still haven't settled the big questions. So it's a bit of a messy story. And I would say that, the story is not just about cuts as well. I think, in the media we could do more on solutions, innovations, where are councils doing things right? Where have they got things that other people could learn from to solve problems? And that's something we're always interested in hearing about the FT. I was sat with the leader of North Yorkshire last night. He was talking about his business ventures, which are profitable, apparently. I'm sure there are many other cases in this room. I think, the image of councils with our readers, who tend to be financially literate, fairly dynamic people, is probably not particularly high. And I think, things could be done to put that right. I think it's more in the districts that this has been happening, but there's been a lot of property, buying going on because of the way the finances work. You can buy assets and rent them back, and most of our stories about that have been negative, to be honest. Who are these councillors and officials, meddling in what they don't know, buying old shopping centres and thinking they can run them better than the private sector. Actually, maybe they can, and maybe you've got some examples, or know some examples where they can. And I would, I do think that devolution as well is another big challenge for the counties, because I, as you know, work in the north, where a lot of the reason that I got involved really in council politics and covering it was because of devolution and the combined authorities and the rise of the Northern Powerhouse and the Midlands Engine and now the mayors. And in terms of visibility, I do whatever one thinks of Andy Burnham, you can't avoid him. And I wonder how many other national figures there are in local government, if you know what I mean. Some of the names of representative organisations we know, and we hear from a lot. But when Richard Leese was just leader of Manchester, which he still is, I don't think I heard him on the Today programme once. Andy Burnham is sort of on speed dial. And I think that has an impact, on the country, and it has an impact on the government, because if you've got constantly somebody, even if demanding and getting a platform, it can make it, hard for the government to avoid it. And one thing which has slightly baffled me is that, local government is overwhelmingly, certainly in this room and more generally, Conservative run. And yet, it's a Conservative government which is constantly taking funds away and sort of multiplying problems. And I think there's a fascinating political argument there, which is probably seething under the surface, possibly. But maybe, could come a little bit more out into the light, if only for the government's own good, because, austerity is supposed to be over, and the public will expect to feel that. And you wonder whether they are going to feel it over the next year or so. So, I think I will stop at that. So we've got some time for questions. Yeah. But hey.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Right, is there any questions from anybody? Let's put the lights up, and then I can see if anybody's got their hand up. Have they? Yep, in the middle there, I think.
Good morning. It's Louise Goldsmith, leader of West Sussex County Council. It's a bit left field, but yesterday we had a presentation about care. And a startling figure which will affect everybody in the room is that there's going to be a 200,000 shortage of care workers. In West Sussex, we have a real issue finding care workers. And these care workers for the press may not be sexy, may not be interesting, but a good care worker changes the lives of the residents that we have to look after. And the shortage of them is a major concern for any of us delivering good social care. The profile of a social worker, a care worker, is I'm only a care worker. They probably do one of the most important jobs to look after our grannies, our aunts and uncles and everyone. I would really love the press to pick this up. We can give you loads of information. We've been absolutely challenging the government and asking for some training, a proper career path to ensure that we get more people in to do that very important job that most people do not want to do, but makes such a big difference to people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it is a big issue and as a county network, it's particularly difficult in our rural areas, I have to say, and in areas where we have very little unemployment. Alison, do you want to?
I would just say that I agree that's a huge issue. I mean, it was the subject of the National Audit Office report earlier this year, and they highlighted the scale of the problem. And it does seem to be, well, rural areas, it seems to be particularly acute. But generally across the country, the difficulty of finding people who will do a care job and stay with it seems to be very tricky. But I think there is another thing about, which is a society level question about how we respect and treat people who are actually doing a really vital service. It shouldn't be that they're competing with supermarkets, to get that we're competing with supermarkets to get people in to do that job. It is such an important job. I think, can we do more in the media? Absolutely. It's an ongoing issue. So, yeah, I think you're right to raise it.
Patrick, would you be willing to do an article on how good our domiciliary care workers are? Important?
I think we would, and the question for us is how do we frame this? Because I think this is, as I understand it, this is also a question about often the affordability of housing, and it's also a question that is pertinent because of Brexit as well. I don't know what proportion of your care staff are EU nationals, for example, or from overseas. I think there's a really interesting story, but I have brought it to I've brought the numbers to the attention of our news desk, and it's not a story, I think, that has a lot of traction when you're just talking about numbers. I think we have to find a way of telling the story in a different way and explaining and illustrating the impact on family lives.
I mean, I would say you need, again, drama, which, means a home closes because it can't be staffed. The residents are moved out, at 48 hours notice. I know that's happened before in places. But it should be, reported when it does. Often it just happens, and there's a lot of, stretch and papering over the cracks. And the slight problem with these is there's a 2 billion hole in this. There's a shortage of these. People want to see what the actual effects are. So you're saying, okay, I'm shutting this place because I haven't got the staff. Then people wake up. And to me, the whole, I don't know a huge amount about adult care, but the whole system is a sort of parallel universe. I mean, we know councils can't afford to pay as much as it actually costs to look after people. And there's a sort of like conspiracy of sort of silence, just keeps it going somehow. Care home owners are handing back contracts, care home owners are over indebted, the private ones. Yep. There's a huge bubble out there which is going to pop at some stage. And when it does, I guess, sadly, that might be when people start noticing.
Somebody at the back I saw, there's somebody right, and somebody further back.
Keith Manns, Deputy Leader of Hampshire County Council. My question is mainly directed at Alison. If I could sum up a lot of the stories one hears on the BBC about local authorities. They're normally human interest stories, which is great and understandable, but I've often found them pretty superficial as to what the real deep problems are. To me, when it comes to the delivery of public services, you either do it directly from the centre, as the NHS tries to do, in my view, not very successfully. Or you delegate specifically responsibilities to local councils, and social care is a good example, or you give those delegated authorities discretion themselves as to how those services should be carried out in their own area. And I think, and this is probably all three of you, there is a lot to be said for a bit more analysis as to which is the best way and how these services are delivered and what the future is. And if I could just add this point, there's also a tendency to give the impression that what went on yesterday when a change is happening is better than what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's not always the case. And I think, again, a bit of sort of thinking forward, because the services will change regardless of the amount of money available, simply because the need is changing. And again, I think that needs to be looked at in a rather more overall way. And finally, I totally agree with the comments made about Louise, by Louise. Sorry about by Louise. We have a crisis now in the care industry. There isn't a proper career for carers, and yet we need more and more of them. And I think that's a really good story to focus on and continue to focus on in the media to try to get something done about it.
Thank you. I think that came to you again, Alison. Sorry.
I think there will be stories. Well, it's a human interest story. I think to get people to pay attention to an issue, you have to give them a reason for listening and taking the issue on board. And I think, generally speaking, certainly all the audience feedback in terms of the BBC, and I imagine my colleagues also find the same, is you have to tell people why it matters to them. There has to be a degree of empathy. In limited time, that will, have an effect on the depth of the analysis. I think one of the beauties, perhaps, of for us at the BBC of also now having online outlets, it means you can then go into more analysis with things. I don't think we've got the perfect answer of linking all those things up, but that is one of the ways of looking at it. But I think the nitty-gritty discussions about which is the best means of delivery is probably a political argument. I think part of our role is to spark the debate, if you like, seed the debate, give the information, and then allow those in the positions for making those decisions to slug it out in terms of which is the best way forward. So I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, but I think, speaking frankly, in television, certainly a news piece which might last 3 or 4 minutes if I'm lucky, nuance and in-depth analysis are tricky. But I view it as a starting point for a debate.
I think we've got time for one very quick question, have we? I don't know where the team asked, but is the Minister here? Yes. One very quick question at the back there, and I think, sorry, could have gone on for a lot longer, I think.
Thank you, Jane. Matthew Jellings from a company called MG. So many things to say. Thank you for coming, first of all, and well done to Simon and his team for getting you here. The majority of the people in this room have been living with this for 10 years. And you are presenting it as you're just waking up to it because it's become a drama, which I find staggering. Why don't we talk to you, or why doesn't the sector talk to you? Because you portray them in a bad light, a negative light, I would guess. And you talk about a 3-minute, 4-minute article. The BBC ran a whole week of articles on the NHS, and even then we came out of it badly. So I would ask you to think about that going forward. Thank you.
Would anybody
Right
like
to
to
reply?
respond? Right to reply. Please, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean,
the Minister walks in.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, you know, I think the FT prides itself on treating everyone fairly and trying to set out the issues with facts rather than opinions. So, if you feel you've been treated badly by the FT, I hope that's not the case. I agree. Some of the rest of the media has an interest in, you know, portraying things in a certain light. You know, in the end, the media is there to interest its readers. Otherwise, we don't exist. So we have to tell stories in a dramatic way, even the FT to some extent, because you can see online now who's reading what. And if the story's down there and nobody's reading it, nobody's going to spend their time publishing it because it's a waste of our resources. So we have to, you know, even if I would love to do the story, I have to justify it to my news organisation and our readers have to be interested in it.
Can I just come back on, you know, for instance, the week on the NHS, there was also, not a week, but certainly 3 days of on care services on BBC Main News. There is a disparity between the coverage that social care gets and the NHS gets. There's no doubt about that, but the coverage of care is there and has been for a long time. What's happened, I would say, is it has risen up the agenda. It has been easier for it to get be higher up the running order, if you like, make it onto the main bulletins. Stories have been there. And to be frank, in a sense, you have to pick the journalists that you feel able to work with. Journalists, like every other profession, you will find a range of people with a range of ways of working. I would say most of the people I know want to tell a story as fairly, accurately, and powerfully as they can. And the reason for doing that is you want people to pay attention. If you make it dry, if you make it boring, people will not pay attention. They will forget it's even been there. So it's not the drama in that sense. It's trying to explain to people how it affects someone's lives. And, you know, so you could call it drama, I suppose, but I wouldn't. I'd say, talk about it, what it means to people in terms of their daily life.
I just want to say I feel personally slightly wounded by that idea. I feel like I've been ploughing this lonely furrow of local government for years. 6 years ago, we interviewed Baroness Scott, for example. Don't tell us we haven't got our finger on the pulse. I will just finish by saying it is all about the story. You have a window now, and I think the media is very, very open to talking to you. You know, approach us off the record. Let's have a chat. Let's talk about how we can tell this story together.
Thank you, and thank you all very much. This is the first time the CCN has done this, and I think by the audience you can see it was well received. Thank you. Thank you for what you've done in the last few months to help us as counties get our story across. But quite honestly, I think the challenge is out there to you and me to actually work with you much closer and use the CCN to help us do that and put us together with you. And let's work together into the future, because there's going to be some stories, I can know that. Okay, thank you very much.